Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout of victory.
In our reading that was just read for us a moment ago, there was a contrast made between different members of the body. Talking about the physical body, but making that contrast between the spiritual body. We in this room are all different people. We're just different. And that means we have different needs. That means we have different ideas. That means we have different habits. We have different thoughts. It's best put this way. We're just different people. Now that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. How dull would life be if everyone was like me? How dull would life be if everyone was like you? If everyone was exactly the same, we'd all be doing the same things. We'd all have the same habits. We'd all have the same hobbies, the same ideas, the same thoughts. I think the Lord was wise making people different. But that tells us something about ourselves. Each of us need different things. Our topic tonight is encouragement for eternity. And I want us to look at three different things that hopefully will help us encourage ourselves and encourage others for eternity. You know, we live in a world in which people believe that this is it. We live, we die, and there's nothing else. If I ask you to agree with that, would you? No. No one in this room would agree that after we live and we die, that's it. Eternity plays a great factor for the child of God. If I were to ask you tonight to raise your hand, and I'm not doing such, how many of you want to go and spend your eternity in heaven? Everyone in this room would raise their hand. If I asked tonight how many would like to spend their eternity separated away from God, outside of heaven, no one would want to raise their hand. And that tells us something about ourselves. We want to be in heaven. But as we talked about this morning, life's hard. That was kind of the emphasis of the spiritual growth class. Sometimes hard things are presented to us. But we can do so if we work at it. In the account of Matthew 25, remember there were three individuals presented with different talents. Remember the one man who was given one talent? What did he do with that? He was afraid of it. He was scared of it. He didn't know what to do with it. So what did he do? He hid it. He hid such. I want to tell us tonight, before we really get into our discussion, we can hide our lives, and I can let it waste away. Or I can be like the other two that are in Matthew 25, and I can take life, and I can use it. We can use our lives for so many different things. You know, waste, idleness, uselessness, and do nothing is not what the Lord requires of His children. We know our lives today need to be lives of service. I was talking to someone recently, and they said, I want to go to church, but I don't want to just be a pew sitter. That makes sense. Because we understand that just coming into the assembly and just sitting is not like living the life in which we talked about the life of Christ. There are three things we're going to talk about tonight that will help encourage us for eternity. Number one, we're going to talk about time. We're going to talk about time. Then we're going to talk about self-control. And then we're going to talk about service. Now that to a degree will overlap in this morning's sermon with the life of Christ, but I think it's good for us to review again in a different manner some of these things. But I want to make this clear as we begin. We want to use tonight to encourage each other to make it to the right side of eternity. Everyone's going to make it to eternity. It's just which side you're going to fall upon. I can't guarantee which side you will fall upon. That's up to you. You cannot guarantee where I will be in eternity. That's up to me. But I think if we took a moment just to look around tonight and we realize there are people around us, there's people sitting beside us, there are people here doing the same things, there were people leading prayers, people leading scriptures, we have people leading singing for us. We're here for a common purpose. Number one, we're here to worship and praise our Lord. But number two, everyone in this room wants to be on the right side of eternity. And to do that, it takes time. Let's think about time. Go with me to Genesis 1:1. And I want us to notice a few things in the very beginning of the book of Genesis and think about time. There's a lot said about time in the book of Genesis. There's a lot thought about of time in the book of Genesis, but there are a few things we need to really briefly think of. If I ask you how much time you had on the earth, how much time could you say? Could you tell me I've got 52 more years to the day? Could you tell me I've got 24 more years and 7 weeks to the day? Could you tell me I've only got 1 week left? I can't answer that for you either. I don't know if I'm going to make it 1 more week. See, that's an outlook. That's not to be grim or dim, but we need to face something about life. There is only so much time left. And there's not a one of us in this room that knows how much time is left. But I know something about time. We learn something about God and about time in the book of Genesis. Look at 1:1 again with me. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. How much time did that take? How much time did that take? Well, as we continue down reading these things, we find the first day. In verse 3, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, and it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. I want us to know something about this day. You know, our modern world has tried to come up with theories about how our world was created. Many people say that there was some type of collision in the universe at one time, and this earth as we know it began. Some like to say the universe was a collection of gases and a few dust particles, and there was an explosion. Our universe was created. I want to encourage us something when we're thinking about eternity and we're thinking about time. God set this universe up. There's one thing the Christian does not have to worry about. I do not have to worry about which scientific theory states how the earth began. Because the Lord tells us here plainly, He created it. And I learn a lot about time in the creation account. We see the first day, and then if we look at verses 6 through 7, the second day, the third day in verses 9 through 12, and we could go on until we make it to that seventh day. I want to ask you a question. How long were those days? How long were those days? Were they 24 hours? Were they some long gap of space of time? Or was it something else? I want you to know that some people believe this word day, and let's look at it in verse 5, the very last two words, the first day. Some people believe that day was a great chasm of time in which God created these things on the first day, and they call that a chasm of time. I want us to know something about this word day in verse 5, and it follows the rest of the words in the Old Testament itself. This word day in its original form only means one literal 24-hour-a-day period. It is exclusively and inclusively used only in that time frame, 24-hour day. We get the understanding of this in verse 5. The light was called day, and the night or the darkness was called night. What happens when the sun rises and when the sun falls? There's that day and night equivalent. How many hours does it take for the sun to rise and the sun to fall again? We learn that very plainly. But I want us to notice something else about these days. The Lord had a plan for those days. And in the midst of these days, He used them. I want to ask us a question when we're thinking about days. There are 24 hours in every day. There are approximately 365 days in a year. And after every year begins, another one begins. And there is nothing that I am going to be able to do to stop time. If we could say pause right now, what happens? And just say pause. You know, when you're watching a video at home, you can hit that pause button. And it's almost as if what you're watching stops. We have no pause button on life. I can't fast forward. I can't do anything different than what it's doing. God used these 24-hour days very importantly. When we think about time, I want us to notice a few references to time before we make our initial point about what we're trying to accomplish here with thinking about eternity and time. Psalm 90 verse 12 says, "So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom." Ephesians 5:15 and 16 says, "Look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of time, because the days are evil." John 9:4 says, "We must work the work of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no man can work." Even Ecclesiastes 12:1 says, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw nigh, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them." I want you to notice from those four passages that there's one theme that's being spread. And it's a theme that involves time, of course, but there's one theme that's evident. I think the best one that explains it was Psalm 90, verse 12. "So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom." A heart of wisdom. If there's anything we need is wisdom. We need to know how to control our days. Have you ever had a hard time scheduling your week? Every Monday when I get here, I sit down and I have an 11 by 17 sheet of paper that sits on my desk, and I print a new one every week. And on that paper, I try to outline what happens in my week. I try to schedule my days down to the day of what I need to accomplish for this week. That's a hard task. Have you ever thought about Genesis' account? When God set out for creation, that there was a plan, and that plan went off seamlessly. We learn those things through His Word. You know, when we start to plan our days, do we remember to put God in them? When we start to plan our week, do we remember to make sure that we've planned to be at services at an appropriate time? Or we've planned, listen to this one, do we plan regular time at home to study? That takes planning. It's not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen because we wish for it to. It's not going to happen because I think I'm going to remember. But it happens when I control my time. I want to ask us a question before we move on away from time. Does God command too much of our time? Maybe the better use of that phrase is, does God demand too much of our time? Many people will say that. Many people will say that being a Christian is just too hard. He demands too much of us, and it's a hard life to live, and I can't do it. Go with me to Luke 9. I want us to notice something about this question. Really, three things we need to notice about this. Does God demand too much of our time? Now go to Luke 9 and look at verse 23. Really, verses 23 through 25. There's something being said about time in Luke 9, 23 through 25 that many times we forget. Time involves planning, as we've noticed. We find in Luke 9, verse 23, "And he said unto them all, If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, but whosoever will lose his life for my sake, the same shall save it. For what is a man advantage if he gain the whole world and lose himself or be cast away?" Did you notice a word that really stood out there? It's in verse 23. We have to take up our cross daily. We all have struggles. We all have things that burden us, and many times they're different. Many times the things that bother you may never bother me. But we know something. Each one of us will go through these things. Romans 12, 1 and 2 talks about a holy living in which we live. It talks about a time in which we live that's holy, a time that which needs to be acceptable unto God. Go there, Romans 12, and notice verses 1 and 2. There's something specific about our time in Romans 12, 1 and 2 that we need to remember. We find here, "I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Did you notice another phrase that was found here that seems really important? I'm not talking about the phrases that's talking about proving what is good and trying to prove what's acceptable and trying to prove the will of God. I'm not talking about the section that talks about being not conformed unto the world. We understand if we're going to live as Christians, I can't be like my world. We can drive within minutes of this building, and there are other buildings in which Christians have no business being in. But there's a phrase here, especially when we're asking the question, does God demand too much of my time? The answer is no again. I'm called to holy living, but notice the ending of verse 1, which is your reasonable service. Does God demand too much of our time? Is being a Christian unreasonable? Not according to Romans 12, 1 and 2. Go over with me to Hebrews 10, 2. There's something else we need to make an application of when asking the question, does God demand too much of our time? And I want to go ahead and tell you, when you think of Hebrews 10, I'm guaranteeing you most likely your brain went to verse 25. That's where mine goes. That's where mine goes generally in chapter 10. I'm not going to talk about attendance right now. I'm not going to talk about attendance. I want to talk about what we do while we're here and ask if God demands too much of us. Begin with me in verse 19. "Having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiness by the blood of Jesus Christ, by a new and living way, which he hath consecrated for us through the veil, that is to say, his flesh." Let's pause for just a moment. We're talking about something that Christ prepared for you and me. Does that mean I'm demanding too much? He's demanding too much of my time? Verse 21, "And having a high priest over the house of God." Now notice this. "Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with the pure water. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised." Now notice verse 24. "And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works. Does God demand too much of our time when we're supposed to be provoking each other to love and to good works? When we show up for an assembly, is that too much of our time? We know it's not. Because we see in verse 22, we're drawing near in a true heart. We're purified by the blood of Christ. Verse 23, we're holding fast our profession when we show up to an assembly. And we're helping each other. I think the world would be different, at least for many of us, if we would keep in mind that attendance to worship is not just showing up, but attendance to worship is encouraging someone else for eternity. And let me tell you, that takes time. Let's talk about self-control for just a moment. Self-control. We already know in 1 Corinthians 16, or 1 Corinthians 6, 15 through 20 tells us that we, as children of God, belong unto the Lord. He's the one that holds us. He's the one that keeps us. He's the one that sustains us. But not only that, He sustains this world. He holds it. He keeps it. There's a song that we sing, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this phrase, but it says, He holds the germ within the hand, talking about how small our world is in the grand scheme of thinking about God. Revelation 1:5 talks about the high price that it took to save mankind. Do I really need self-control? I mean, is that something a Christian needs? I think that's an honest question we need to spend just a moment with. Go with me to Galatians 5. Galatians 5. Galatians 5, and let's look at verse 23. Galatians 5, verse 23. When we're thinking about this particular section, we find all sorts of things that are being talked about, beginning in verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. And they that are Christ have crucified with the flesh and the affections of the love, or of the world. Do I really need self-control? If I'm going to live as a Christian, do I really need to be able to say, I have myself under control? Do I really need to be able to present to my world someone who is under control? Here's what I mean by that. Am I under control of this book? You know, we can control ourselves in many different ways. We control ourselves as we sit in an assembly. We control ourselves when we're singing in the worship. We're going to control ourselves when this assembly is over. Have we ever considered that how we acted may encourage someone else for eternity? The little things that we may be able to do can encourage others for eternity. That's really our main thought for tonight. Am I going to take the time to do it? And am I going to control myself enough to encourage someone else for eternity? I've already said this, but I want to say it again. We're all going to be in eternity. It just depends on which side of eternity we're going to be. And that's up to you and me. I want you to know it's just as important for each of us to be in eternity with the Lord as it is for the other. You know, we have great examples of people who controlled themselves in Scripture. I want to look at just a few of them for just a moment. Go with me to the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel, and go to chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. There's some intriguing things that happen in the book of Daniel, really, that cover self-control. Especially when you look at Daniel chapter 1 and you begin in verse 8. Daniel had a request that he wanted to make. He knew it's what he needed to do. He knew it's how he needed to live. And he knew he needed to control himself. Remember Daniel being in captivity here. Read verse 8 with me. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the princes of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. This entire account goes all the way down to verse 21, and we're not going to, for time's sake, look at that. But I want to ask a very crucial question about self-control. If we're placed in a position in which we'll have to compromise on things that the Lord has spoken on, well, I'll ask someone to allow me to not defile myself. I don't know what it took for Daniel to say, I can't do that. I do know that Daniel knew the laws of God. I do know that Daniel, for as much as we can read about him to this point, was an upstanding, great man. But I know he was left in a position where he had to say, I can't do that. You're all looking at me right now with this face. And that face tells me that you have been there too. And I want to tell you something. You're going to be there again, most likely. Can we be like Daniel? Can we control ourselves enough that whatever comes in our way, we can be like Daniel and we can request, we can do like Daniel in verse 8, and we can purpose in our heart not to defile ourselves. 1 Corinthians 9:27 talks about the Apostle Paul and how he had to buffet himself daily to keep himself under control. It may be that daily I have to do this, but I want to ask you something. Is a little self-control worth an eternity in heaven? Is a little self-control worth losing the soul? I think you know it's worth everything it can be. There are some other in which we could look at in the Old Testament and even in the New, in which people decided they knew what God required of them, but they left Him. We could look at someone like David in 2 Samuel 11, who later would come back to the Lord. We could look at Solomon in 1 Kings 11, 1 through 11. We could even go inside of the New Testament and look at people, and this may be a name that you remember, Demas. There's a particular scripture that says, "For Demas hath forsaken me." I believe if there's anyone that knew better, Demas did. Could you imagine being around the Apostle Paul and the encouragement that he would have been giving you? And then you leave the faith. That's really where we leave ourselves. If you think about the parable of the sower in Luke 8, and in the ending of that parable in verses 14 and 15, it talks about the good ground. And it talks about that good ground in a very specific way. And it says that good ground is going to bring forth fruit unto perfection. I want to encourage us to know that the only way I'm going to be able to bring things to fruit of perfection is through self-control. It's through self-control. Let's think about one other thing before we conclude our thoughts tonight. I have to use my time appropriately. I have to have self-control. But not only that, I need to be a man or a Christian lady full of service. Full of service. I want to brag on some of our ladies here, and I'm not going to mention them by name for fear of forgetting. But you need to find out who works with the Virtuous Women's Program. There are 18 T-shirt dresses that have been sewn, made, stitched, and they're on their way here soon this week to go to Africa to be given to little girls who do not have anything to wear. I talked about what we talked about this morning, putting their hands to service. That's it. Those dresses are sitting in my office in a box ready to go out this week. I want you to know there are things happening here that are worthy of mentioning. I think that's one of them. Giving up so much time, and I can tell you it took a lot of time and it took a lot of patience to get those dresses sewn. But I have to be someone of service. I think that tells us something. You know, this is really what the Christian develops in. He develops into an attitude of service. When one is saved, he needs to become a person of service. James 1:1 talks about a servant, and it used the words or the word doulos in the original language, which means bondservant. I'm a servant and I serve because I am indebted unto Jesus Christ. And there's nothing else that could replace that. We talked about Jesus this morning, and we talked about how his life was about service. Remember Luke 19:10, to seek and to save that which was lost. Even Mark 10:45 and Matthew 20:28 through the following passages talk about the life of Christ and how he was here to serve humanity, the entirety of mankind. Paul was an apostle. He was a servant. I want you to go with me back to Romans chapter 1. And let's notice one other thing. Romans chapter 1. Paul was a man who was a servant. Sometimes we're going to have to, or at some point, we're going to have to take the life of Paul and just lay it out before us. And just see what he did in his life as an encouragement to us. But Paul was one who wrote about service. And I want you to notice what he wrote in Romans 1:14 through 16. There are three things that we're going to notice he's going to be doing here. He's going to open up his eyes. He's going to lift up his head, and he's going to go to work. He's going to go to work. When we look at verse 14, we find, I am a debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are in Rome also. And here's a passage that's familiar to us. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. He was a man of service. He was a man of service, and he outlines it here. As one who is willing to serve, he understands he's indebted. He's not just indebted to Christ, but he's a debtor to both the Greeks and the barbarians, to the wise and to the unwise. That means one thing to us. He was indebted to every single living soul on the face of the planet at that time. And he would even view, in my opinion, of those that would be there after he's there. Because he understood he was a man in which lived, a man in which had sin in his life, and he became a man in which sin was removed from his life. You know, we talked about time. We talked about self-control. And we talked just briefly about service. Those are three areas in which we can use to encourage each other. We can use our time. We can help others. We can do things. We can do what we need to with our time. And we can use it and know that it's important. I can use self-control. Sometimes that's the hardest one of us all, hardest one for us all to use. A little bit of self-control goes a long way. Then I can use my service. So many things I can do, just like being in participation of our spiritual growth class. That's a service in which encourages others. It's something I can do to grow. It's something I can do to be better for my Lord. Eternity is waiting. I'm going to say it again because I've already said it twice. Everyone will meet eternity. It just depends on which side you will be. You may be like the one this morning who realized her life was not right with the Lord, and she needed to make it right. You may need this evening to make your life right with the Lord, and I want you to understand something. You're not making it right for me. You're not making it right to me. You're not making it right because I'm the one preaching the sermon tonight. You're making it right because the Lord is knocking at the door waiting for you to do such, and He is the one that can remove your sin. If you've been a child of God and you need to make your life right, now is the best time. If you're not a child of God this evening, and by that I mean you've not used this book to see what it has to say for mankind to become obedient unto the Lord, tonight's the best time for you. If you need to do such and you need to make your life right with the Lord, why don't you do so as together we stand and sing.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace in the mansions bright and